My name is Jan Robinson. I'm a member of North Branch Friends. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second in a series of webinars on the topic of peace and justice presented by the North Branch Society of Friends. We are the local Quaker meeting in the Wyoming Valley area in Sterling, Pennsylvania. Our first presentation, How to Support Our Transgender Neighbors, was very well received and is now available on YouTube if you missed it. This presentation will also be recorded and will be available on YouTube in a few days. You can ask questions today by typing them into the chat. Quakers have always been involved in social justice issues. We have worked for the equality and well-being of all since our start in the 17th century. We were admonished by our founder, George Fox, to walk cheerfully over the world, answering to that of God and everyone. We believe that every person has a spark of the divine, so it stands to reason that we would deny war and violence of any kind. Just refusing to go to war, however, is addressing the problem way too late. We are advised to live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars. We believe that working on issues of social justice and promoting understanding between people is a good way to do that. There is a Quaker proverb, "Thee lift me, and I'll lift thee, and we will both ascend together." Towards that promotion of understanding, we present today a speaker who is a member of our meeting, award-winning author and teacher, Allan Austin. Allan is a professor of history at Misericordia University. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree from Bowling Green and his Ph.D. from the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Austin is an immigration historian, primarily interested in investigating the contested meanings of race and American identity, especially in the 20th century United States. He has examined these issues in his book, From Concentration Camp to Campus, Japanese American Students in World War II. He also authored the book, Quaker Brotherhood, Interracial Activism and the American Friends Service Committee, 1917 to 1950, published in 2012. He has published articles in various scholarly journals and anthologies as well. Today, he will be speaking on concepts explored in his newest book that he co-authored with Patrick L. Hamilton, Ph.D., a fellow professor at Misericordia, titled All New, All Different, A History of Race and the American Superhero. This book has won the John G. Coelty Award for the best textbook from the Popular Culture Association in 2020. It was also awarded the best book for use in the classroom in 2020 from the Midwest Popular Culture Association. If I cite all Allan's achievements and awards, we will be too long getting to this intriguing subject. So Allan, thank you so much for being with us and welcome.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was much too generous an introduction, but I do appreciate it. I can see some of the attendees, some of whom I've not seen in a long time. So it's very nice to be here tonight, even if it is at a distance. I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint presentation for a talk that should run 45 minutes or so. I'd be happy to hang around afterwards, obviously, and answer questions or just talk about what interests you and what is going on here. So I think that unless somebody tells me that things aren't working, it looks as though the PowerPoint is up and ready to go. Look good? Well, let's go back here. All right. So I know that I am supposed to talk about superheroes and race tonight, but I hope you'll all bear with me as I try to trace briefly first how it is that I came to write about this kind of thing. Because I think thinking about my journey for a minute is a good way to frame what I want to try to accomplish tonight. So my wife, Vicki, and I joined North Branch Friends meeting in 2001. And we were drawn to the Religious Society of Friends for many reasons, but part of the draw for me actually came from my scholarship. My first book, which Jan mentioned, From Concentration Camp to Campus, started out as a history of Japanese American college students during World War II, but it quickly became very much a Quaker history as well. And as I did that research, it was very easy to appreciate the ways in which Friends chose to do more than just talk about racial justice during the war. Instead, they connected their faith to activism in reaching out to help victims of American racism. And that first book then prompted a second, Quaker Brotherhood, which really is an attempt to kind of explore and understand the roots of that wartime Quaker activism. It's clear that there is much to appreciate in friendly racial activism. Both books taught me, however, that Quakers, like everybody else, are complicated, contradictory, and I guess the best way to put it is they're just plain human. Despite this reality, Quakers have often been portrayed as flawless anti-racist heroes. So 3 quick examples might suffice to make that point. We might look, for instance, at Edward Hicks's 19th century paintings on the Peaceable Kingdom. Here we see him valorizing Quakers as they amicably establish relations with Native Americans. Or second, we might consider Charles T. Weber's painting, The Underground Railroad, displayed at the 1893 World's Fair, which celebrated 2 very familiar stereotypes: heroic Quaker Underground Railroad conductors and their helpless and grateful passengers. The painting, again, of course, reinforces a well-known third example, the saintly Quakers that manned the Underground Railroad in Uncle Tom's Cabin. These kinds of understandings of Quakers have made it easier on the other side to present Quakers as little more than racial hypocrites, activists who talked about equality but failed to actually live to it as they succumbed to a racism even within their own institutions. These oversimplified portraits of Quaker heroes expose seemingly only friendly hypocrisy and have inspired a widespread debunking of Quaker interracialism. One quick example I might point to would be Herman Melville, who in writing Moby Dick wrote about what he called the fighting Quakers, who had sold their souls for more immediate rewards, more immediate material rewards. For example, he described a fictional friend in his novel as, quote, having long since come to the sage and sensible conclusion that a man's religion is one thing, in this practical world, quite another. In the end, though, what I believe is that studying people in history is more complicated. People are, after all, just human. Activists pursuing racial justice, to draw my point a bit more broadly, have to be seen as complicated and even flawed human beings. And this understanding helps us perceive a harsh truth. Good intentions don't always produce good results. And this is one idea that I'd really like to focus on tonight. Sure, as we get to the superheroes, which will be here in a minute, I promise, we're going to see examples of a blatant racism that clearly exists in American history. We're also going to see, however, efforts to do better. As we look at the latter, we have to do for ourselves what I've tried to do for Quakers in my previous books. We need to critique well-intentioned activism that sometimes fell short. Such a criticism of liberalism, I would argue, in American history presents a path for doing better today. So tonight, I want to take you on a tour of one Quaker's perspective on conversations about race told through comics that might help us ground our approach to social justice today in ways that are informed by our Quaker identity, our national history, and the dilemmas that confront us right now. And I want to do that by providing an overview of a book that I co-wrote with my colleague and good friend, Patrick Hamilton, who was part of the English department at Misericordia. The book grew out of a lifetime of reading comic books on both of our parts. The first comic book I remember reading was X-Men number 95. And this was a comic book that literally changed everything for me, even though I didn't really understand it at the time. Now, if you just look at the cover, it seems like pretty ordinary superhero stuff. Four X-Men are kind of battling it out with some pretty anonymous bad guys. But this comic book actually represented a pretty momentous change in the comic book industry, as it featured one of the first intentionally multicultural teams to arise in the 70s. So pictured here, for instance, we see Storm, an African-American hero, Colossus, who's kind of a Russian brawler. We see the swashbuckling German Nightcrawler kind of hidden in that bottom corner. And then in the other corner, we see Thunderbird, a Native American. Sadly for Thunderbird, and this, spoiler alert at this point, he is the hero referenced at the top who will die at the end of this issue. Now, as a kid, I think I just loved the melodramatic adventure of all of this. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the racial politics of Thunderbird's death or the racial politics of this new multicultural team. But those racial politics were there nonetheless. So Patrick, who's just a little bit younger than me, started by reading a book about another team from Marvel, probably better known today, the Avengers. The first comic book he remembers owning is this one, Avengers 164. Not coincidentally, the Avengers also confronted race and multiculturalism in the late 70s. When the team had grown too big, the United States government actually stepped in and ordered the Avengers to cut back to just 7 active members. When it told them they had to cut to 7 members, they also forced the African-American hero, the Falcon, onto the team. The Avengers are obviously upset and shocked by this decision. When asked why the untested Falcon was to join the team, the government responded that, quote, if the Avengers are to be sanctioned by the government, they have to adhere to government policies, including equal opportunity for minorities. The arrival of affirmative action in comics at this time reflected contentious racial conversations in the broader society. So, in these ways, the X-Men and the Avengers introduced both me and Patrick at a very young age to deeper questions about race in the American experience. That this was happening at this particular time, of course, was not coincidental. It clearly is reflecting the impact of the civil rights movement that had come. The industry was reflecting contemporary conversations about race while also shaping the ways in which Patrick and I looked at and understood the world. And that's really the main thrust of our book, that comics not only reflect existing attitudes about race, but also help to shape those attitudes. An aspect of comics that often goes unnoticed because we see comics as just entertainment, kind of a cheap entertainment. But this often unnoticed power of comics matters because popular culture is always selling us something, and not just shirts or shoes or Taylor Swift. It's also working to shape the consumer's understanding of the world that they inhabit. In our cases, both Patrick and myself, we were both introduced to comic books at a particularly interesting moment when the comic book industry was starting to sell a nascent multiculturalism. And it wasn't just the X-Men and the Avengers. It also included, to name just a few, Luke Cage, Black Lightning, and others on the printed page, as well as the Super Friends cartoon on television. But even this was not a totally novel endeavor. Superhero popular culture had long been not only reflecting, but shaping American conversations about race and ethnicity, and it would continue to do so after the 70s as well. But if we are kind of unaware of what comics and superhero popular culture could do, at least some of its creators understood their potential power. Again, an example. We might think about Robert Maxwell. Maxwell was the director of Superman's radio show during World War II. He understood the power of what he was doing. When the Office of War Information wrote to him, asking him to dial back what was a very, very ugly campaign on the part of Superman against the masses of German and Japanese people, Maxwell refused to change his message. He wrote back to the OWI, quote, "I can formulate ideologies for millions of youngsters, and I am, at the moment, teaching this vast audience to hate Germans and Japanese people." Importantly, Maxwell's hate was racialized too, as he attacked the Japanese as, quote, these are his words again, "the little yellow man who had knifed us in the back at Pearl Harbor." Now, such power could be wielded for more accepting attitudes, or to encourage more accepting attitudes too. Not long after Maxwell's hateful screed, the actor George Reeves, television's Superman, promised parents in the 1950s that his program was, quote, "concerned with giving kids the right kind of show. We try in our scripts to give gentle messages of tolerance and to stress that a man's color and race and religious beliefs should be respected." In the 21st century, Marvel's Uncanny Avengers asserted the power of popular culture in a very similar way. Here, the superhero, the Wasp, is explaining to her teammate, quote, "Popular culture has a long history of helping ease people into accepting the different. Jazz, hip hop, punk rock, music, and fashion can change the world." Here, the writer Rick Remender reminded his more self-aware readers that popular culture can both reinforce and constitute cultural attitudes and beliefs, even while masquerading as mere entertainment. Well, this power applies to race too, but not simplistically. And we should be sure to avoid both uncritically attacking as well as unilaterally celebrating comics. Superhero popular culture has had the power to both reinforce racism and to contest it, to both encourage people to cling to the status quo, as well as to move them to resist it. In all such ways, superhero popular culture, since Superman's portentous arrival in 1938, can help us better understand an evolving American conversation about race. So our book thus begins with the arrival of the modern superhero in the middle of the 20th century, just as the world was collapsing into war. As they entered World War II, the American heroes relied, not surprisingly probably, on racially problematic understandings of both friend and foe. So let's start with friends. In Young Allies, a fairly popular wartime comic book, Whitewashed Jones arrived in the Young Allies, embodying a wide range of the basest, ugliest stereotypes that had been applied to African Americans throughout American history, especially in the 20th century popular culture. Readers from the beginning during the war understood whitewash as a stereotype, not as a human being. Throughout the series, he failed to challenge the audience's expectations with his mangled dialect, his dim-witted antics, his over-exaggerated features. Furthermore, unlike his truly heroic teammates, Whitewash is always fearful and looking to avoid a battle. What help he offers the team almost always arrives accidentally. In these and many ways, Whitewash presented little that deviated from racist stereotypes of Black Americans. The arrival of Cato, the Green Hornet sidekick on the silver screen, seemed more promising. Here was, after all, a guy who was a scientific genius who provides the Green Hornet with an array of sophisticated gadgets. He's also an excellent field operative. But any sense of seeming equality was quashed by Cato's relationship with the Green Hornet. Cato is always a sidekick and always very willingly kind of a compliant sidekick. He spends most of his time on the silver screen, not battling crime, but serving as a valet and a chauffeur. And in accepting his role as a manservant, Cato's depiction tended to emphasize the subordinate status of Asian Americans in American society. Turning to the enemy, wartime superhero popular culture focused on racial caricatures that erased any real difference between the Japanese enemy and Japanese Americans. Superman, in this way, went to war with a somewhat surprising animosity, not only for Japanese, but for Japanese Americans as well. Here, for example, to the left of your screen, the Action Comics cover, Superman uses a common wartime racial epithet to erase any boundaries between Japanese and Japanese Americans, reducing all of them to one undifferentiated, threatening mass. The racial hatred demonstrated on this cover was even more manifest in his comic strip, in which he spent a couple of months in 1943 battling nefarious Japanese Americans who work in league with the Japanese enemy to destroy the United States from within. The Man of Steel did the same in his wartime cartoon adventures at the movie houses, taking on the Japanese American you see pictured here, who professed loyalty to the United States, but acted surreptitiously to destroy it from within. Over and over again, Superman's exploits functioned to eradicate any difference between Japanese and Japanese Americans. Nor did Superman act alone on the assumption that Japanese Americans were essentially Japanese and thus inherently disloyal and traitorous. The Young Allies, to go back to that example, in this way warned readers that, quote, even in this great land, which is America, sinister forces are loose, seeking to destroy the freedom we so cherish. Such accusations were likewise embodied by the villainous Daka, who you see on the other half of the screen here, in a Batman wartime serial. Daka's repeated feigned loyalty taught viewers that one simply could not trust Japanese Americans to mean what they say. Similarly, Japanese and Japanese Americans were dehumanized and painted as violent. They were repeatedly described as rats and skunks and rattlesnakes. For instance, one more example from the Young Allies here. The Young Allies went to war against a clearly dehumanized enemy, pictured here, meant to intimidate and terrify readers, both young and old alike, calling the reader to support a war effort meant to protect Americans from such despicable enemies. In all of these excesses, superhero popular culture erased any distinction between Japanese and Japanese Americans, along with the humanity of all of them, easing the way, of course, for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans in the United States during the war. So after the war, comics companies found themselves walking a fine line. An anti-comics movement was starting to gain momentum in the United States, and the Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union made American racism and prejudice an international issue. And so the two dominant companies in the post-war era, DC, which would have been the established leader, and Marvel, which is just beginning to rise into prominence under a number of different titles at this point. These two companies had to figure out how they were going to best navigate this increasingly complicated world. Not surprisingly, both companies generally sought safety in flattened depictions of racialized people, as well as unchallenging tales far removed from any kind of contemporary issues. But both also took at least halting steps towards representing a multicultural society. As they did so, superhero popular culture finally undertook a more sustained focus on the racial challenges presented by the diverse America. So, if you want to find examples of comics that looked more to past racial understandings instead of new ones, well, those are pretty easy to find. Post-war comics often used non-whites as little more than backdrop for the white hero's adventures. Be it Lois Lane attending a professional wrestling match, Superman visiting Peru on his TV show, or Batman and Robin, as you can see here, traveling back in time to Cleopatra's Egypt, non-Western cultures were used as spice, making stories a little more interesting, but nothing more than spice. Even when non-white characters assumed larger roles, they typically remained backwards and helpless, as when, for example, Superboy has to visit what he describes as quote unquote, darkest Africa, or when Batman's adventures with Native Americans, he's traveled back in time here, presented primitive natives always in need of paternalistic aid. It's a recurring theme that white folks need to kind of fix non-white folks. Such paternalism was clearly on display also at what would become Marvel. Captain America, for instance, battled communist threats in Egypt and China that contrasted white and American progress with exotic and inferior others. The arrival of the Fantastic Four showed Africans here to be primitive and less than whites. And the Hulk's adventures, depicted in the flip side panel, took him to Asia, where primitive villagers could only hope for white aid. They are completely helpless in terms of helping themselves. So comics of the Cold War era also fused pre-existing racial anxieties with contemporary concerns. At DC, Wonder Woman's adventures presented racially treacherous foes that any reader of 1940s comics would easily recognize, although now embodied ridiculously in the form of Egg Foo, who is the gigantic egg that you see just hanging out on the screen there. The earlier arrival of the Yellow Claw at Atlas brought this perceived threat home. The villain promising to destroy the United States, quote, from within, as the lowly termite crumbles into dust the most majestic structures. Such problems remained even after Marvel officially arrived. In the pages of Iron Man, the arrival of the Mandarin represented the apotheosis of the Oriental enemy, a dehumanized yellow peril-style threat that persisted even as Asian Americans were joining the civil rights movement in the US. But if these regressive images existed in the 2 decades after World War II, both DC and Marvel were at least beginning to reflect and shape more progressive attitudes as well. Superman's comic books resolutely dodged serious critiques of race, but his radio series actually took on the Ku Klux Klan in a storyline called Clan of the Fiery Cross. And his TV program actually managed to present sympathetic and human Chinese American characters in a story called The Riddle of the Chinese Jade. While Batman also generally avoided issues of race in his comics, the story The Phantom of the Library, pictured at the top here, provided at least a rare and brief glimpse of diversity. Batman's adventures in the 50s also provided a more positive look at an Asian American. On the bottom, we see Paul Wong. Paul is clearly a vision of assimilation in his Letterman sweater, his shirt, and his tie, and he plays an important role in helping Batman solve an ongoing mystery. Marvel also gestured towards new ways of thinking after the war. A broadly defined tolerance actually showed up, believe it or not, in all places in the pages of Sergeant Fury, which saw a Japanese American, Jim Morita, stand up to racism during the war. Sergeant Fury also featured the arrival of Gabe Jones, who served with distinction. Marvel further moralized on such issues in the early pages of the Fantastic Four. In their battle with the hate monger, for instance, who used his H-ray to transform ordinary Americans into hate-filled racists. The villain's defeat allowed writer Stan Lee to deliver a moral via Mr. Fantastic that you can see sort of towards the end of the story here, when Mr. Fantastic says, quote, "Until men truly love each other, regardless of race, creed, or color, the hate monger will still be undefeated. Let's never forget that." Now, if Lee's moralizing was at times a little overdone and preachy, other changes at Marvel, I think, more subtly and probably more effectively began to promote racial inclusivity. For instance, the early Marvel comics often had streetscapes that were exclusively white. So in the panel on the left, Jack Kirby, one of the most famous, most beloved artists at Marvel, he draws this panel and he shows the superheroes' exploits being backgrounded by a well-to-do and white crowds. In panel after panel in Kirby's comics, white men dress in suits and fedoras, while well-manicured white women wear stylish dresses. Clearly, Kirby is kind of drafting an ode to an exclusively white middle-class America. But unlike the street scenes of Kirby, the artist Steve Ditko was drawing backgrounds in The Amazing Spider-Man that included a range of African Americans. Now, although these African Americans were almost always not well fleshed out characters, just seeing African Americans as a natural thing in these panels presents as a simple assumption the idea that the United States was multiracial, or I guess at least here, at least a biracial society. And I would argue this is kind of a quiet but a revelatory change in comic book storytelling. As the civil rights movement gained national attention in the 60s and the 70s, superhero popular culture became more earnest in representing and fostering racial attitudes. Comics creators sought to challenge stereotypes and to change the minds of readers by confronting established white heroes with racially charged situations and racially marked individuals. The most famous example of this is undoubtedly the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series of the early 1970s, written by Denny O'Neil and illustrated by Neil Adams. It was a series that was hailed then and ever after for its pioneering efforts to bring what some have called social relevance to the comic page. If you read scholarship on superheroes and race, you almost always see this image. It has to be the most often reproduced image in all of sort of comic book art in terms of telling stories of race. Here, Green Lantern has just unknowingly rescued a corrupt landlord from outraged citizens. And Green Arrow has confronted him with the urban realities of poverty and racism. He kind of takes him on a tour of urban poverty and racism. And in these three classic panels at the end of the tour, what the narrator describes as a quote unquote ancient black man confronts the Green Lantern, pointing out how the hero's done more for alien races than he has done for black people. Green Lantern has no answer for him. He can only hang his head in shame. Green Lantern and Green Arrow's ensuing adventures then become the tableau through which the hero attempts to redeem himself. When dealing with race, the creators, however, exhibit the limits of the very liberalism that their comic attempted to spread. Rooted in a post-war liberal consensus that saw the problems facing America as neither structural nor requiring radical change, the lauded creators located discrimination within discrete individuals who needed to be reformed. In the slums, for instance, here, the evil is boiled down to one landlord who ends up in jail. And while that seems like a happy ending, it hardly solves the plethora of problems facing inner city residents. Though the series repeatedly brought some recognition to these larger issues, it betrayed no intention of actually addressing them. In fact, to the extent that such issues were addressed, the series placed the responsibility on non-whites themselves to fix the problems. For instance, depicting the poverty and deprivation of a Native American reservation, the series blamed the victim, and Green Arrow thus chooses to disguise himself as the tribe's legendary chief and paternalistically chide the Native Americans into action. The lesson is pretty clear here in the second panel. It's Native Americans and no one else who have the imperative to make change happen. Other comics of this era also earnestly confronted racism and prejudice. At both DC and Marvel, heroes came into contact with and at times conflict with Black, Asian, and Native American individuals and communities. Such encounters invoked an ideal of brotherhood. You can see it like literally written on these covers, of course, with titles such as Brother, or Take My Hand, or Man, Thy Name is Brother. However, this ideal came heavily conditioned. Non-whites themselves had to do the changing these comics asserted in order for brotherhood to be achieved. At DC, Flash, Green Arrow, and Lois Lane all told people of color to accept the racism they faced as just part of the quote unquote normal ups and downs that everyone faces. At Marvel, Thor and Daredevil lectured African Americans to overcome by fixing themselves, reinforcing the notion that brotherhood could be achieved with only Black and not white action. In addition to selling this brotherhood, superhero popular culture of the late 60s and 70s also strove for inclusion through the introduction of numerous ethnic superheroes, seemingly speaking to comics of growing awareness of non-white persons and communities. However praiseworthy these intentions, however, there were problems. The creators of these ethnic superheroes often traded in time-worn racial assumptions that were barely disguised in what they were presenting. Depictions of non-white heroes based themselves in long-existing stereotypes. For Native Americans, it often boiled down to what one scholar has called the noble savage stereotype that we see in characters like Black Panther or Red Wolf or Dawn Star. Racial stereotypes common racial stereotypes common in film were likewise replicated in the comics. An assumed Black affinity for aggression and violence underlies several characters. You might think about Luke Cage or Blade, as well as Jon Stewart, as pictured here. The Black Superwoman also began to show up at this time in characters like Bumblebee and Misty Knight. The demeaning comic character that we've seen kind of back in World War II with Whitewash Jones also arrived again, occasionally bleeding into the depiction of characters like the Falcon or Jon Stewart and even the Black Panther. So Asian American superheroes similarly repackaged earlier stereotypes. Sunfire from the pages of X-Men plays on yellow peril tropes, as does Shang-Chi, the Master of Kung Fu, and Lady Shiva. Lady Shiva and other female Asian heroes also betray the stereotypes of the Dragon Lady, as they evidence both the cruelty of this figure as well as her exotic sexuality, which is on display both in how these heroes, Lady Shiva and Mantis, are dressed, but also how they act. The two prominent Latino adventurers of the 60s and the 70s, White Tiger and El Águila, did little to disguise their stereotypical bases. El Águila is little more than a knockoff Zorro. That seems pretty obvious just from the picture. And he certainly recalls the Latin lover stereotypes popularized by Rudolph Valentino, with his seductive and dashing and magnetic and smoldering presence on the silver screen. White Tiger's stereotypical attributes, specifically his fiery temper and his laziness, hardly rose above stereotypical expectations, too. It gets worse, because comics also created a troubling sameness in all of these heroes, a reality all too easily dismissed as a result of generic tropes. Though most superheroes obviously occupy major cities, the nature of non-white heroes' urban locales was stunningly similar. These environments reinforced a racialized sameness in an atmosphere of urban blight, crime, and violence. Luke Cage's debut, as you see here, is awash in that kind of imagery. Similar associations pervade Harlem's depiction once Storm and the Black Panther arrived there. Here is but one example from 70s comic books. You could find hundreds of them if you looked. It's the very standard depiction: boarded up windows, a down on its luck pool hall, two Black men standing kind of aimlessly, leaning against the street lamp in the left foreground. Such and always the inner city inhabited by people of color in the comic books. These ethnic characters also have common roles within their communities. Many of them take on social service jobs. The Falcon sets himself up in Harlem as a social worker in his civilian identity. Black Panther and Black Lightning are both high school teachers. And even White Tiger and his African-American girlfriend decide to establish a mobile college in the South Bronx. So the arrival of diverse super teams in the 70s and the 80s was clearly aimed on the part of creators. They were aiming at inclusion, but such efforts continued to reveal shortcomings of multiculturalism in the way in which these squads were configured. Token non-white members, almost always Black, were added to established teams, but they remained largely marginalized. For instance, once the Falcon, we saw him at the beginning, you'll remember, once he was forced onto the Avengers, the Falcon actually missed almost half of their adventures. He just wasn't there. He was also often depicted behind the rest of his team, taking quite literally a backseat to his teammates. Like the Falcon, Cyborg, who joined the new Teen Titans at DC, was often distanced or separated from his team. They party at a local pool, he's not there. They throw a housewarming party for one of their team members, again, he's absent. Token Black heroes often also exhibited an anger that distanced them from their white teammates. Cyborg was often angry, as you see here, but so were others. The New Warrior's Night Thrasher, which is the biggest image on the screen here, actually spent as much time, it seems, threatening his own teammates as he does enemies. The guy that he's dangling off the rooftop there is a potential teammate. And then the new Avenger here that we see in the bottom, who was aptly named Rage. Non-white heroes also often held secondary positions within the teams they joined. So for instance, if you look at the cover of the Justice League that I have projected here, you can see the Japanese hero, Dr. Light, depicted as a member of the Justice League. Only one problem, she was never officially a member of the team. The Latina Firebird, depicted here in the top panel, kind of hanging her head in shame. Similarly, she kind of hung around several issues of Marvel's West Coast Avengers, hoping for an official spot on the roster. She was desperate to join the team, only for the spot to go to a different superhero who didn't even want the job. Even those who ascended to leadership positions found that position often qualified. Storm of the X-Men for much of the 80s would be a good example. She often expressed doubts about her skill as a leader, and oftentimes she would yield the position of leadership to Cyclops whenever he returned or whenever Professor X handed the role to him. But there was some good news. Some of you may know Monica Rambeau if you're watching Disney Plus series. She was the second Captain Marvel at Marvel, and she more fully demonstrates, we argue, how such heroes could be successfully included. Though originally marginalized or diminished as an Avenger in training, Captain Marvel soon becomes a full-fledged member of the team and a mainstay for much of the mid-1980s. But what further differentiates Captain Marvel from the other token heroes that surrounded her in other comics is that her characterization was not based on her race or her racial or ethnic identity. Her specific character plots instead ranged from testing the limits of her power to revealing her secret identity to her parents. She also didn't face racially defined villains as many racially defined heroes did. Via such means, Captain Marvel's depiction allowed her to achieve a kind of inclusion that most token members of the 1980s, to one extent or another, only approximated. So another trend at the same time in the 80s was interracial team-ups that primarily served, we argue, a white audience that was longing for a fantasy of racial harmony. These partnerships, however, almost always remain hierarchical, with the white person on top and the non-white person below. Early pairings would include Richard Dragon and Ben Turner at DC, or Iron Man and Jim Rhodes at Marvel, and also at Marvel Captain America and the Falcon. But all of these firmly placed the non-white hero in a secondary position to his white partner. Other later pairings seemed more potentially equal. The very title, Power Man and Iron Fist, seemingly suggested such progress. Luke Cage gets top billing over the white Danny Rand. And the same seems to be true of Cloak and Dagger, starring a white woman and an African-American man. The potential was not to be fulfilled, however. Not only did the first series often reinforce the socioeconomic differences between Power Man and Iron Fist, thus literally and figuratively locating them in different worlds, but Cage often found himself being instructed not only by Rand, but by his white lawyer, putting Cage in the lesser role of pupil more so than partner. Like Power Man and Iron Fist, Marvel's second prominent black and white duo of the 80s, Cloak and Dagger, meant to be not only inclusive, but suggest equality. The reality, however, was that Cloak, the African-American man, is repeatedly positioned as lesser. He's less moral than his partner. He's less human than his partner. He's less able to control his powers. Finally, and even more profoundly diverse super teams promulgated the contradictions of the multicultural ethos. For one, such teams possess structural problems contradicting such inclusion. Sure, teams included Sunfire and Thunderbird, like the X-Men did, but the ethnic characters often brought tension inside the teams. The ethnic characters were also often exoticized in troubling ways, And if they were women, almost always sexualized in demeaning ways as well. So Storm of the X-Men will become a leader eventually, but spends a lot of her time in her early appearances, like as she is here, shedding her clothes, as does the Native American member of the New Mutants, Danielle Moonstar. Vixen, the other image you see here of the Justice League, is constantly flirting with male members, living up to her name in a way that equated racial and cultural differences with unbridled sexuality. These modest efforts in the mid-'80s would be followed by a broader effort at DC to represent multiculturalism. It happened in the pages of the New Guardians, which for my money is the lowest point of multiculturalism in American history. Well intended to be sure, the comic represented non-white members in ways that commodified their ethnicity and their sexuality. Gloss, who we see kind of in the middle of the cover there, in the green leotard, is overtly sexualized throughout the book. Her flowing red hair is always draping the entire length of her body. But beyond sort of the image being commodified, the series based its very premise in assumptions that linked sexuality to ethnic and racial identity. In contrast to the blonde, blue-eyed, and white Harbinger, who is utterly naive about and innocent in regard to sex, the ethnic characters repeatedly boast about their sexual prowess and desires. In the 90s, creators wrestled with issues of race in part by turning to ethnic replacement heroes. Transforming an established white hero into a non-white one seemed to promise an easy, ready-made inclusivity. It often didn't go particularly well. Here, for instance, we see a couple of panels from The Punisher in the 1990s, when the hero was temporarily turned into a black man. If you look at the images, we can clearly see it's echoing Rodney King, and we understand that the creators want to address race, but they couldn't escape the gravity of long-held racialized tropes. Even worse would be a character like Psylocke, once a white woman who is transformed into an Asian hero. Psylocke clearly relied on racialized understandings of Asian women. To be sure, her psychic powers and her fighting abilities were enhanced when she became Asian, but that superficial empowerment barely disguised a superhero defined almost entirely by her racial difference, her newfound penchant for violence, and her over-the-top sexuality. Other stand-in heroes did no better. In the pages of Uncle Sam and the Freedom Fighters, the Native American Black Condor arrived, but only as an aggressive and hyper-violent character. The white to Latina replacement hero Wildcat also debuted, but was grounded in a host of stereotypes: hypersexuality, impetuousness, and bravado among them. If we wanted to find something that was maybe a little better, we might look at the new Adam, the replacement Adam, Ryan Choi. Not perfect, but at least represented a real effort to understand stereotypes and address them. At times, he was too much probably of a model minority, but overall, he clearly was an attempt to show down racism in the United States, challenging stereotypes of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, with his relatively smooth adjustment to life in America, assembling a team of white geniuses that support him, but are always secondary to him. They constantly acknowledge that he is much smarter than them. So another approach that writers employed to humanize ethnic replacement heroes borrowed from Peter Parker's fraught journey to heroism. So you probably all know the Spider-Man story. It feels like almost all Americans know it now. He's not a perfect hero when he first gets his powers. Only his Uncle Ben's death, indirectly the result of Peter's selfishness, teaches him to strive for something better. He doesn't emerge a perfect hero. He's often barely managing to juggle all the problems in his life, school and girls and jobs and whatnot. But readers really gravitated to that very human Spider-Man, kind of identifying, I think, with his coming of age arc. But Peter's story then provided creators with a mirror by which readers might see ethnic heroes differently. And so we see that happen again and again in the pages of Superman. After the quote unquote death of Superman, Steel emerges, initially seeming little more than a stereotype, but eventually a moral, intelligent superhero. At Marvel, Deathlock is doing the same thing. It happens for other ethnic groups as well. At DC, the white Blue Beetle eventually becomes Latino. Jaime Reyes takes his part, and Jaime Reyes is the classic Peter Parker, not a care in the world, very much a free spirit. He stumbles into power, but goes through an arc of growth and mastery that allows him to become a true superhero. But this apprentice to master arc is perhaps best demonstrated in the pages of Ultimate Comics Spider-Man, which featured Miles Morales as the Ultimate Universe's Spider-Man. This new Spider-Man traced his predecessor's path to heroism. He was also a well-developed character that lived in a city, but wasn't defined by a stereotyped city. He lived in a multicultural world that seemed both natural and the wave of the future. And as a result, Miles Morales is from the start a human and empathetic character. Other writers and artists around the turn of the century, maybe frustrated by these old constraints, tried to do something better as well. Some failed miserably. So we'll gloss quickly over what they were doing at Image with sexualized images of ethnic women and using race as a running joke, and jump ahead to Milestone, which was an African-American owned and operated comic book company that created characters like Icon and Hardware. Icon, you see pictured with his sidekick Rocket here. And it's a really, I think, a really well done comic in many ways, not only kind of showing differences within the African-American community, but also exposing the broader institutional racism that frames African-American debates. Hardware was introduced as the classic kind of angry black man, but quickly grew into a very human and moral character. To wrap things up, we might come back to Marvel and DC, which gave sort of rebirthed some classic characters like Black Lightning or Luke Cage or the Black Panther. We'll focus on Luke Cage here as we're running out of time. But Luke Cage emerges in the 21st century as a transformed character, no longer defined by aggression and violence, but now a moral center to the Avengers who was embarking upon fatherhood. In recent years, let's not jump ahead there too quickly. In recent years, both DC and Marvel have relaunched their comics lines over and over and over again. And every time they've relaunched, DC and Marvel have talked about the importance of diversity in their relaunches. The fact that they continue to relaunch, I think, suggests in part that they're struggling to figure out how to handle diversity. While many struggled to do well, one that we might talk about or focus on for a moment is Kamala Khan, the new Miss Marvel, a Muslim teenage superhero who has met with immediate acclaim and has quickly become a mainstay in the Marvel universe and soon will be joining the Marvel Cinematic Universe as well. So to wrap, the recent past in superhero popular culture as well as the wider world is both encouraging and disheartening. In other words, it's pretty much just like the past 80 years have been. In this way, the ups and downs of our superheroes suggest our real world struggles to address issues of race. In the funny pages, we can find blatant racism to resist, and we can find well-intentioned activism to improve upon. Looking at comic books more closely in either case has real power as they continue to reflect and actively shape attitudes about race, for good or for ill. So thank you for your time. I appreciate that ran, I will have to admit, a little bit longer than I hoped it would, but I would be certainly happy if Jan or Elaine is out there to answer any questions if there are some. I see a hand up, for instance, but I don't think I have the power to call on somebody with a hand up.
I don't see that, Alan.
So Meg Mitchell has a hand up.
Okay.
So Meg, I don't know. Well, Meg, her hand is now down, so maybe she did not actually have a question.
Oh, she said that was a mistake.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, that was easy. That was an easily answered question. So I did run a bit long.
I'm looking for
Yes.
questions in the chat, and I don't see any yet. So let me ask one from me.
Sure.
The hate monger sounds really familiar. Where do you think we stand as a society and in the comics in the aftermath of the last administration?
Well, I'm kind of glad you asked that, because it allows me to kind of self-promote in a shameless way. So Patrick and I actually wrote an op-ed that you can find online, I'm guessing pretty easily if you Google about for it, where we talked about the hate monger in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump, and tried to use the hate monger as a way to think about the thing about the hate monger's power, Jan, is that it doesn't turn perfectly nice people into racists. It amplifies racism and nativism and dislikes and anger that people have. And so I think the hate monger is in fact a terrific lesson for us as we kind of think about the way in which Donald Trump stirred up racial animosities over the course of his getting elected and his working or his being president, but that he was able to succeed ultimately only because there was racism and nativism and sexism to tap into. And I think the hate monger is a really, really useful analogy in that way, that, yeah, we should blame leaders who use race and racism to get elected, but we have to remember that they can do that because Americans have this racism in them. So it's always also a nice touch that the hate monger in the comics might be Hitler. We're just not sure, because Hitler apparently had a lot of body doubles, according to the comics. So it's a great question, and I think it's one way in which reading comic books might get us to think more seriously about the world in which we live today. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Hope. How does Sam Wilson's story in The Falcon and The Winter Soldier in taking on the role of Captain America compare to his story in the comics?
That is a great question, Hope. And I'm sure you're asking it because you're interested in, not just because, you know, you're related to him. But so Sam Wilson's path from the Falcon to Captain America on the Disney Plus series is obviously echoing what happens in the comics. The same thing happened earlier in the comics. It's told a little more directly on TV. They don't have as much time. I think I found the Disney Plus series really well intentioned, wanting to obviously address race in America, but I was ultimately a little bit disappointed. If any of you are at all interested in this stuff and you want to read a really good graphic novel, I would recommend a graphic novel. It's called Truth in Red, White, and Black. And it's the story of Isaiah Bradley, which I think, Hope, is actually the more interesting story in some ways. Isaiah Bradley was one of the African Americans that they tested the super soldier serum on before they gave it to Steve Rogers, a white man. And so the idea of this story is that much like the Tuskegee experiments, that African Americans were used essentially as lab test subjects to get the formula right before it was given to white men. And it is, Truth in Red, White, and Black is a fascinating story that wrestles with the history of America and race from slavery through the Harlem Renaissance to the present day, and does so in ways that I think really that are very challenging and important to think about. So I would strongly suggest it. Oh, I think Elaine might have actually posted a link to it in the chat. So well worth reading. So to get back to your question, Hope, maybe I didn't answer it, so you can always, you know, keep harassing me if you want to. It's a similar story. I think the comic book Truth does it better than the series did. Okay, let me see another question. Yes. Is it the one that says, how can we best acknowledge the good intentions of those creating comic books? Or did I miss one? Or no, I need to go back further.
There's one, will the superheroes take on critical race theory?
That is a great question, Elaine. And the answer is probably not as much as we would like them to. It's clear when you watch a Disney movie or you watch the series on Disney Plus that as much as they want to promote a multiculturalism and an inclusion, that there are corporate limits to what they feel comfortable doing. And so a deep engagement with critical race theory, I think you can find it in something like Truth in Red, White, and Black. I think you can find it in some of the stuff that Dwayne McDuffie wrote. He wrote the Icon series that I talked about towards the end of the talk. And you can find the Icon stuff pretty easily online and used at Amazon. You shouldn't use Amazon, at a used bookstore near you. So I would say, Elaine, they do and they don't. When they do, it's often going to be more quietly than we'd probably like them to. Despite all of the complaining on the right about woke culture and the woke mob, it's hard to find really radical messages in mainstream popular culture. I mean, if it were radical, it wouldn't be mainstream, I suppose, by definition.
Okay. The general question, Victoria Ramo, let's hold that for a minute and go to the one you mentioned. How can we best acknowledge the good intentions of those creating narratives within comics while challenging them to do better?
Well, it's hard today because it's hard to have a conversation without people immediately yelling at each other. We do that, I think, by fostering communities that allow us to have hard conversations. That we do it by pursuing an education that helps us see that the world's really complicated, and thinking about it in black and white terms, it's either perfect or it's terrible, will help us have those conversations. So I think, Vicki, like trying to find an appreciation for complexity in history, number one, and trying to find ways to build communities where we can have conversations that sometimes, by the way, will be very, very difficult conversations to have. But if we can't have them, there's not much hope for the democratic endeavor that we're undertaking. Now, as a Quaker, with believing that there is that of God in all, I am committed as a teacher to the idea that we can have those conversations, but we have to get better at having them. And when we're criticized, I should say too, when we're criticized, we should be able to listen to that criticism and do some self-assessment as well. We all have learning to do. Sorry, Jen.
Okay, well said, well said. Let me go back to Victoria Ramo. The general question was, which is an excellent question, I need to educate myself on systemic racism. God in his mercy has opened my eyes after years of ignorance. Can you point me to good sources of information on systemic racism and bigotry? As they say, the best way to fight the enemy is to understand it. We at North Branch have just all this season have been studying several good sources on white privilege and systemic racism, but I don't have the things right here to tell you. You might want to go onto our website, which I'll give you later on, and some of the people in the meeting can send you some of the things that they found helpful, if you'd like to do that.
There's also some good scholarly work that you can read that's pretty accessible. The guy that I studied under at Cincinnati, Roger Daniels, wrote an immigration history textbook of sorts. It's called Coming to America. I would recommend. It's a bit old, but I think it's timeless in his approach. I think in terms of thinking about immigration and ethnicity, that would be a terrific place to start. Certainly Ibram Kendi is in the news a lot, but his scholarly work, Stamped from the Beginning and things like that, would certainly be worth looking at as well.
Okay, let me just check for, okay. All right. Another question, why do you think the characters of comics are so hypersexualized? And how do you feel the ideas of race and gender intersect?
Well, to understand the sexism of comics, I think, Jan, is to understand the sexism of American society and the historical power of that sexism. That comics, sort of what became mainstream comics, were very much male dominated in their early years and are struggling to kind of move past that. You know, there's a certain tropes have been established, but I think thinking about that sexualization is really important in terms of intersexuality too. So I would point you to a character again like Psylocke, who really finds herself in a double bind. She's not just Asian, she's also a woman, and thus finds herself burdened by intersecting and compounding stereotypes. And so in many ways, one of the ways we can have better conversations is to think about intersectionality in those ways, to stop thinking of just women or just African Americans or just Japanese Americans, but thinking about those intersections and the ways in which they create different, larger, and perhaps more powerful communities.
Because the way it seems to me is that the hypersexuality of the white male characters seems to be a positive thing, but a negative thing for the people of color and women.
Well, yeah, because many times, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but non-white male characters often become the object of a sexual gaze, not unlike women do. So Steele, for example, is in many ways like a very positive character, and yet he is still sexualized in a way that you almost never see sort of happening to Captain America or Iron Man. Theirs is a masculinity and a sexuality that they're in control of. Women and people of color don't have control of that sexuality, right? They're victims of a sexualized gaze. And I think, again, this was a talk about race in comics, but we could do the same thing with gender. And I think we would see the same ways, that there are comic books that are trying to reshape the way we think about gender and sexuality in this country. And there are comic books that are just leaning as hard as they can on those age-old stereotypes to sell. And as long as those comics sell, the problem is as much us as it is the creators.
Okay. Let me check what are your thoughts about the new superheroes? Teen Titans come to mind, who may be ethnically ambiguous and are also actively disparaged by established characters. For Teen Titans, the Justice League, is making characters' racial backgrounds unclear helpful or not?
That is, Weaver, a really terrific question. And my answer is, and this is why students hate me, I think it's really complicated. And I don't know that it's better per se or worse necessarily to be clear or unclear about their ethnic background. It's really the way in which the individual creators of the comic book treat that character. That I could imagine situations, where either could work in a way that could be really educative and really help people imagine a different world or think about the world differently. And that's what great art should do, right? Or even bad art should get us asking questions about the world in which we live. I think either one could do that, but either one could also go horribly wrong. So, I mean, that's a complete cop-out to the question, but it is, I think, an authentically complicated answer, which is it really comes down to the ways in which creators handle characters.
And Elaine just asked, are there any non-binary superheroes?
That is a good question that I cannot answer with full confidence. I am confident that there are. If I had to name, I could not. But Elaine, I would be happy to do some digging and get back to you on that.
Do you think the readership of comic books is now more for adults or children?
Clearly, it is more for adults than it was in the past. If you go to a comic book shop, which I do, I go up to Comics on the Green in Scranton on a semi-regular basis. I would say on the newsstands, it leans more towards adult. The comic industry has changed. You can still find comics written for and about kids. But anybody who's watched Riverdale on the CW knows that even Archie isn't really for kids anymore. Like there is this kind of adultification going on. So I should have mentioned Loki. I mean, John is right that he is definitely, well, he's gender fluid. And so, gosh, we really need the panel that was here last time to join the conversation probably at this point. So there are others, and Marvel just did an issue that kind of celebrated its queer characters, but there was a lot of controversy about that as well. There was some sense that they were trying to kind of hide Loki's non-traditional identity. So again, the large corporations are going to continue, I think, to struggle with this because they're trying to always balance maybe doing what they think is right with, of course, always making some money.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Let me check the Q&A.
I really appreciate the questions, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, and I really appreciate the patience of everybody sitting through the talk. So if I am done, Jan, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. It is much appreciated.
It was wonderful. If there's no other questions, we'd like to thank Allan for his expertise and this fascinating look at a part of our culture that reflects our culture. Thank you so much. This presentation will be available on YouTube in a few days. If you have enjoyed it, please share it with your friends. We'd like to announce that our next webinar will be on August 12th at 7 p.m. The title is Plastic, the Environment, and Us. The speaker will be Donica Cooper Buchanan Wollaston, a founding member of Pittsburghers Against Single-Use Plastics, who now serves on their steering committee and who is also a member of North Branch Friends. We hope you all will join us again. You can find out more information about Quakerism, North Branch Friends, and contact information on our website, northbranchquakermeeting.org. Allan, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And thank you everyone else, and good night.